Alrighty. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pochtecaland, a channel where we promote the history of Mexico and the U.S. Southwest. Here with me today, I'm honored to have with a close friend of mine, a fellow U of A alumni with me, Dr. Macias from Fort Hays University. He is an expert on the Mexican Revolution. His main focus is on Pancho Villa, and it just so happens today is the anniversary of Pancho Villa's birthday. So this is actually pretty perfect how we're going to begin. We're going to have a conversation about the general idea of what the Mexican Revolution was about. So we're gonna have some simple questions for some people, and there's gonna be a lot more in-depth conversations as we go. So we hope you all enjoy it, and we look forward. And I'm gonna have Marco kind of introduce a little bit more about himself to kind of get you more involved, kind of get more involved in what we're gonna be talking about.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction. Yes, we know each other from the University of Arizona. I don't recall how many years ago we were on campus together. And yeah, I've been at Fort Hays since the fall semester of 2018. Hays is, I would say, in the middle of Kansas along I-70. And that's where I teach Latin America related courses, among them the Mexico course. And so today we're going to have a conversation about the Mexican Revolution and kind of a starter guide, right? I'm looking forward to our conversation and the questions we'll have and try to unpackage together.
Yes, I look forward to it as well. It's always interesting. I remember the Mexican Revolution was kind of the first people's revolution, correct? I believe that's what Dr. Beasley once said back then, correct? Yeah, and so it's a very interesting time frame also, because if we're looking at the 1900s, it was really in that world, everybody was kind of switching. Obviously, we're talking about 1910 to 1920, so obviously the world was a major change at that time too, especially with World War One, and also monarchs throughout the world were also changing too. So in the case for Mexico, even though Mexico didn't have a monarchy, they got rid of their monarchy decades ago. They still had Porfirio Diaz, who was the dictator of Mexico for a while. So was that kind of seen like a monarchy in a sense at that time, would you say?
I would say that the Porfiriato, which is the time frame that runs from the rise of Porfirius in 1876 to his downturn in May of 1911, is kind of an authoritarian regime. It is a dictatorship of sorts, but I mean he gets reelected, so is democracy pure in Mexico? No, but Porfirio uses these mechanisms of voting to revote himself into power. So, a dictatorship is the perpetuation of power by non-democratic means, which to some extent or another kind of fits the case of Porfirio. But really, where he strays is in the 1910 election. And he strays before that because in the interview with James Clearman, a U.S. correspondent, he says that he's not going to seek election in 1910. Of course, he will decide to run for a re-election again at the age of 80 years. And so, but that moment in 1908 when he says, I'm ready to not be president, really opens the gates to opposition, one of them being a wealthy landowner by the name of Francisco Madero, who strongly believed in democracy and thought that was the right way for Mexico to go. So yeah, I mean the Porfiriato, or sorry, the revolution starts kind of this. The way I see Madero is he's advocating for political change, but somewhere along the message, the message gets interpreted as social, political, and economic change, and that's why I think he's so successful, and also leads to his own demise, because everybody's listening to what they want change, and Madero's promising change, but he's not promising the same pace of change, and he really is looking for a political change,
Mhm.
right? Because at the end of the day, he's one of those elites that have been benefited by the Porfiriato and the system that was created under Porfirio Diaz.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that before we go ahead dive deeper in, it's great that we talk about this background about before the revolution. And it's great to realize that the Porfiriato was kind of it was a major change in Mexican history, and this is why Porfirio Diaz is also seen as this very controversial character in Mexican history, because a lot of people see that he was good at an economical standpoint because he helped change Mexico, revolutionize it in many different aspects. But at the same time, he kind of didn't allow his own people to grow from it because he allowed foreign investment to kind of control the country. And we see that especially in railroads and oil at that time, which later leads down the road of why the Mexican government went ahead and nationalized that later on after the Mexican Revolution. But this kind of segues why the revolution was started, would you say?
I think you raise a good question, or raise a good point also, because as you mentioned, right, Porfirio Diaz, and it really is, positivism, everything that's going on at the world at that time, where countries like Mexico are giving or being forced to give their natural resources to the United States or Europe. So you're right. He promotes growth, but that growth is benefiting foreign investors. It's benefiting people that aren't in Mexico, right? Or even in Mexico, maybe it's benefiting a growing upper middle class. That's great, but the majority of Mexicans aren't upper middle class. They are, they're not seeing the benefits, right, of all this change. And if anything, if they are, if they question the government, that they get reprehended. So it really, there's a disconnect between the elites and the average Mexican, that when Madero comes and says, I promise change, people say, okay, this is new information. We're gonna run with this. I usually tell students, like, imagine yourselves being at the moment of the Mexican Revolution or the French Revolution. How hard is it to say, you know what, I'm going to stop doing what I'm doing. I'm going to risk my life to go pursue something that's beyond me. Like,
Mhm.
even today, like, what would put us in a corner to say I'm willing to risk my life to change the status quo of the society I'm living in? It's and that's something happens, and something has to click with people for them to say enough is enough. And so the Mexican Revolution is kind of one of these moments. And it's interesting because you mentioned at the beginning, right? It is the first social movement of the century, preceding the war, the First World War in Europe, but also preceding the Russian Revolution, which is perceived as the truly one of the great social movements, a very structured layer, if you will. And that's why the Mexican Revolution doesn't fit nicely in a box of revolutionary theory.
Yeah, and especially how you were mentioning what makes Mexicans want to rise up on this. And if we're thinking about this, if you're looking at their history, also Mexico at this time was fairly, as an independent nation, was also still very young, even though that it got its independence in 1821. It kind of had a mindset, or at least it was a country that has been having many conflicts in the past, because of not only was it that they had that once the large empire that went down to Central America, they lost a lot of land throughout their early decades. So they lost, of course, central parts of Central America. They lost the Texas Rebellion, which later led to the Mexican-American War. Later, the French come in. And so now you have Porfirio Diaz, and what has he exactly done to help the people? So that I think that's a way that we can look at this on what really created these change, these cause and effects. And so one thing that really started it, you would say, was it really they always say that the final straw of the Mexican Revolution was at the start of it was at the strike in Sonora, right? In Canea, right? Was that really the major straw? That's what made people say, you know what, this is it. We're gonna take arms against this.
I don't know, and I mean that's an honest assessment. Cananea is earlier. I can't remember off the top of my head if it's oh 06, 1906 or 1908, because there are other instances, right? There's the Tomoshik rebellion much earlier, where the inhabitants of Tomochic, Chihuahua say, you know, we're done with the Porfiriato, and in retaliation, they get burnt inside their church by the Porfirian regime. Then we have the Rio Blanco strike in Veracruz. So, you know, we can point to certain instances prior to 1910 where there was this boiling up of things. You know, the November 20th, the start of the revolution, outside of several isolated pockets of resistance, it isn't a general uprising. It's a momentum, like kind of a snowball that's building its momentum over time. And what I think is fascinating is two things: how you know how quickly it snowballs after February of 1911, when Madero comes back into Mexico, and then they kind of take over. They're at the outskirts of Chihuahua, of Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, and then they take over Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, and that's the moment, you know, that Porfirio Diaz says, you know, wait a minute, what's happening? And he sees the writing on the wall and says, okay, I guess it is time to leave, right? And it's not, you know, it's kind. I'm condensing a lot of information because by this point we also have Emiliano Zapata, you know, in the state of Morelos taking over parts of the state. So it's very interesting that we do, and I think Diaz is to blame, but then Diaz is really quick to recognize and back off, and then just go into exile to Paris.
Yeah, that's right, because the Mexican Revolution starts in 1910, correct? And that's where
Mm-hmm.
Madero starts his campaign, but Diaz sticks around for about a year until he bounces off to Paris, right? So there might have been a chance where Diaz thought that he might have been able to turn it around for that. But yeah, so as this is happening, I think this is a this is a major bloody war, as I believe I read that 1 out of 8, there's an estimate that 1 out of 8 Mexicans would die in the revolution. And so what would be some of the results or the impacts that you would say from this sacrifice that the Mexican people had?
Yeah, and actually, yeah, I've also heard that stat, and I think it's accurate, and I also think that's a lot of those disappeared Mexicans have to do with them fleeing into the United States. Um, so that's the thing, right? Even though this kind of first phase of the Mexican Revolution is runs pretty quick, the aftermath, after all the fighting and, you know, internal fighting and Victoriano Huerta and ongoing fighting and the Constitution of 1917, they're really like, if Madero's promising only political change, by the end of the decade, the 1920, there really is a conscientious effort to provide social, political, and economic change, which is why the Mexican Revolution is a revolution, because it does. There are many things that are left in place from a Porfiriato, but it's making a very concise effort to change things and make Mexico more socially equal. Now we can debate if that's what happens, but there is a very conscientious effort in the 1920s
To
by
get
the
the
Obregón
ball rolling.
government to get the ball rolling. Yes.
Yeah. So during the revolution, though, from this conversation or from previous conversations you've had studying this, would you say that there was any misconceptions that you would like to speak on, or what are some of the main things that people kind of lose in translation when they're trying to research about the revolution?
I think trying to keep up with names and what's happening, right? Because so I think keeping up with all the information is a handful, and that is it's difficult, right? So like when we take a look at so something I do, right? With Francisco Villa, it is when if you read non-Vista literature, you get the idea that Villa had no ideology, and it's really hard to pinpoint Villa's ideology. But with like Zapata, it's really easy, right? He's advocating for land reform, land redistribution. Like his agenda is pretty straightforward. But Villa's, because of all this interference, if you will, the ideology gets lost in translation. But like to me, Villa was kind of a progressive. He had very progressive ideas, and he wasn't asking for a social, a socialist society. He kind of wanted everybody to get an equal shot, right, at being able to be somebody, which he thought that not everybody had an equal shot, that the elites controlled everything, and that they needed to do something about that.
Yeah, that
So
kind
I
of
mean that's kind of the misconception, is that Diaz was trying to perpetuate himself in power, and Diaz again, the revolution starts in November. By May of 1911, he's out.
yeah. See, and that's another thing that you bring a very good point about how there's a lot of things going on, and this kind of segues into some of the other questions that we have. Is why would you say there were so many different fractions, and why were so many people switching sides in between during the revolution? Were these different people that were friends originally? They had a game plan, but later on they decided, you know what, that's not the right way we want to go, so I'm going to go ahead and actually fight against you now. How did that play out?
The way you're explaining it to us, we all think differently. We all want different things. And it's, even when I say Zapatistas wanted land reform, I mean they wanted other things also. So yeah, basically, I think it has to do with human conditions, right? People they can be maybe idealistic, and they're fighting for an ideological cause, but maybe their leader, they don't see eye to eye with their leader, and they see that vision in somebody else. So it's complicated. That's the easy, and that leads to part of the misconceptions, right? It's complicated, and I think the best gauge of determining how complicated the revolution is kind of the Constitution of 1917, right? It has so many articles that is trying to. It's an all-encompassing constitution, a very progressive constitution for the time frame, where it addresses, labor rights, it addresses education, it addresses subsoil rights. It's so comprehensive, because it's trying to capture all the different ideologies that the Mexican Revolution is fighting with or against, and saying, okay, this constitution is resolving most of your issues. It's time to put your guns down.
Yeah, so that makes sense, because it's like people are working together, but maybe when they see another opportunity, they'll go ahead and take that when they can. So even though that they'll work with who they can, but when they see an opportunity, they can then change it later down the road, how you mentioned about the human condition. So I think that that's a very good way to put it. And that kind of just leads me to my other question is, how I mentioned how there was all these different fractions. And when you really look into the Mexican Revolution, you realize a lot of these military leaders didn't survive the revolution. A lot of them died in battle. A lot of them were assassinated later on. We can go down a whole list, really. And that's why it's kind of interesting. Who would you say out of this really survived, or really, made an impact after the revolution? I mean, obviously one that sticks out to me, I would say would be Cardenas, who was able to become president of Mexico at that time and was a major figure with the PRI, with the government political party. And he was the one that was a major push in nationalizing Mexican businesses or for resources. Yeah.
Sorry, I muted myself for a second. I think so. In the 1920s, when the dust is starting to settle, I think Alvaro Obregón, one of the survivors, he defeats Villa, he defeats Zapata. Uh, I think Obregón, when he becomes president, starts setting the blueprint in order for Mexico to advance, right? And then his successor, Plutarco Elias Calles, continues with that blueprint. And I think Calles, despite the fact that I think Calles has many shortfalls, is key in the following step. So in 1928, there is the election, and Obregón is running for re-election. It's all they fought against, but he's running for re-election, and he gets assassinated the day shortly after he wins the election, or the day he wins the election. At that moment, still President Calles, right, basically says, the era of men has ended. We are going to begin an era of institutions. So by what Calles does is he starts to institutionalize the revolution, not under a man, but rather under an ideal that lives within what will be the PRI, the political party. And so once that foundation has been set, it allows the PRI, or what will become the PRI, to become this all-encompassing ideological umbrella, of which Cardenas is probably one of the greatest presidents we've had, that comes out of that revolutionary era.
So as you mentioned that the dust is settling after the revolution ends, how would you say that the U.S. or the world played in this, or how did they saw Mexico relations during this time? Was it was it a time that the world saw that they had to like back off from Mexico because of the resources now nationalized, or were they angry at what had happened because now they have to play a new game in Mexico now?
That's a great question. So, as we've kind of talked about a little bit, during the Porfiriato, there's a lot of foreign investors, but also foreign nationals, right? So when you take a look at mining operations, or, railroads, which I know is one of your like niche research areas, a lot of the chief engineers are not Mexicans. These railroad companies are hiring U.S. Men to lead the operations down in Mexico. So of course, during the revolution, all that kind of ends, right? It's too dangerous to go down into Mexico. In the 1920s, the dust is settling, as I mentioned, but there is still one of the things that the Oregon government does, which is, again, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of the creation of the blueprint, is the Bucareli treaties. So under the Bucareli treaty, Mexico is trying to negotiate recognition of the revolutionary government from the United States. It's tricky because the Constitution of 1917 has articles that protect subsoil rights. Why is this important? Because they're trying to protect national oil, which the revolutionaries are already seeing as a source of income for the future. And the U.S. is saying, well, we don't want you to recognize that. We don't want you to we want you to cancel the article, or not put into effect. And so the Los Tratados de Bucareli, or the Bucareli treaties, are that negotiation to, like, okay, we're not going to do it now. We'll do it later, and that's when Cardenas comes later in the late 30s to nationalize oil. So the U.S. does have to negotiate with, or it goes both ways, but the U.S. does have to negotiate with its Mexican counterparts to eventually to basically regain access to oil.
So and so as they're negotiating this, this is of course how the eventually Cardenas creates Pemex, and this creates a whole new industry for Mexico, correct? This is now a major influence in how Mexico's playing in the global market in oil. So that kind of leads me to except because of this new nationalization, I think that this created a new identity for Mexico. So how would you say was the new identity after the revolution? As we know, I think one of the major essays that was major influential after this was, of course, La Raza Cósmica. And also later on, decade by the 1940s, actually maybe in the late 1930s when the Época de Oro was created, the film industry in Mexico started to rise. So there was this new movement, and of course the charro became a popular figure at this time. So how would you describe the new Mexican identity at this time?
I there's a lot of layers to this, but yes. So Raza Cósmica, Jose Vasconcelos, which again going back to Obregón, right? Who put Vasconcelos in charge of the Secretaría de Educación Pública? What would be Educación Pública? Obregón put Vasconcelos in charge, and so Vasconcelos was trying to capture Mexican culture because he thought under the Raza Cósmica that it will all disappear and become one race. So that's why he sent all these teachers and all these anthropologists to go record Mexican culture before it disappeared. It created a wonderful treasure trove of cultural expression of what is Mexico. So the identity of Mexico post-revolution or post-1920s rather is tied to the Mexican Revolution, right? It's the when we it's there. I don't think there is that iconic representation. So like today, for example, if we try to picture the average Mexican in a movie, right? It's probably drug related. So he kind of buchon kind of figure. That's I think that's replaced the Mexican stereotype. And so when we take a look at films, for example, you're right. There's the kind of charro figure, but also there's the Mexican revolutionary figure, right? The big hat wearing, but it's not bandana. I forgot the name. The bullet, cross covered
Bandoliers.
bullet, bandoliers. There we go. There's a very specific image of what a Mexican revolution looks like, and it gets reinterpreted, in U.S. films, in Mexican films, and so to answer your question, I think coming out of the revolution, Mexican culture clinges to that, to itself, in acknowledging that it is part of that revolutionary, of that struggle of the 19 teens, and the government also. That's where its legitimacy comes from, in saying we are the legacy of the revolution. So they're also like key in rescuing and implementing that culture, and people cling to it, right? They feel that attraction to the Mexican Revolution, either because maybe they have family member that served with the revolution. It becomes a nostalgic thing, kind of like charreria becomes a nostalgic thing in the 1930s.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was when we're looking at it, I think it's kind of a new start for Mexico, because not only Mexico was actually now trying to now it was getting new recognition worldwide now too, instead of being a once former colony of Spain and going under the Porfirio Diaz period. Now Mexico is becoming becoming a major player in the world's economy in a sense, kind of like on its own, not being influenced from foreign governments. Because during the 1940s, it also participated in World War II, joining the Allies. So you have the Broceros going over the United States, sending hundreds of thousands of workers to help with the war effort in farming and the railroad in the United States, also in factories. And also, I believe there was an estimated over 10,000 Mexican nationals that even signed up for the U.S. Armed Forces at that time. So it was a major influence. I think this was an opportunity for Mexico to finally have some influence to try to promote themselves. And this, of course, I would say through that, of course, segues into the Mexican miracle, the Green Revolution in Mexico of the 1950s that later came in the 1960s. And it really started. This is when we kind of transition more into modern Mexican history with, of course, the Olympic influence and the economy later on. But all this helps really build Mexico into this modern major player in the world's economy at that time. A new face has emerged out of it. And I wonder also how it played a role in our demographics. We mentioned that the Raza Cosmica was mentioning how it was kind of documenting all of our different cultures at that time. And you mentioned how the author thought that maybe he thought that the original indigenous culture was fading away, but obviously that still isn't the case to this day, as Mexico still recognizes the 68 indigenous languages in Mexico. And there was once a 2015 census that there was over 25 million Mexicans that recognize themselves as indigenous. Um, I think this plays a major factor, though, how we see ourselves as we see ourselves, because under the Porfirio Act, though, maybe there was an influence for us to be more mestizo, become more Europeanized, to accept, kind of allow ourselves to be more accepting society. So now with the Época de Oro, these are allowing us to be who we are, I would say. In the 1940s, it at least allowed us to not necessarily be forced to be influenced by European, but also be forced as something that was pure Mexican in a sense. So with
I do agree with that.
yeah, it's
I
there's a
agree
lot
with what.
more layers to talk about, and more, it kind of opens up other topics to get into, but I think it definitely allows us to see that new face, that new identity that was shining out of this. Of course, there's still conversations to have about it and how that played and influenced each other during that time period. But I would say it was definitely a liberating moment, especially for the poor, to try to get a voice now that they went beyond the revolution. Now they're seeing kind of their action plan. But that kind of leads me to my next question. Would you say that the goal of the revolution did actually become a reality for the Mexican people?
I think the Mexican Revolution brought about significant social, political, and economic change. Now, who benefited from all that? I don't know the answer, and I think in that lays the how successful the revolution was. Now, when we take a look at the 20th century and the existence of Mexico as such, I think the revolution was successful in keeping itself in power. Right, the PRI was very successful. It plays into good neighbor policy in the 1930s, and that's why it allowed Cardenas to even expropriate oil, because he knew that the U.S. was going to need Mexico as an ally during the Second World
Mhm.
War. But more importantly, I within this, like, how successful the revolution was, and this is kind of Cardenas. A lot of this is Cardenas, which we can probably have a conversation only about Cardenas, but like the Cuban Revolution, when Fidel Castro succeeds in late 50s, the only country he does not touch is Mexico, and he does it because there's a basically not a back there's a handshake, a gentleman's agreement that he will not interfere with Mexico, because Cardenas helped him out by letting them be in Mexico. But all this to say, right? Mexico is able to weather the military dictatorships of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, right? Where you have truly military, dictatorships take over Chile, really. The entire southern cone, Central America, right? With starting with in '54 with Jacobo Arbenz. Mexico, because it is able to present itself as a revolutionary government, yet it runs a really fine line between presenting itself as a revolutionary government but still promoting capitalism.
Mhm.
And that's where, like, people might say, but there's a disconnect. But the Mexican government is very good at running that line between, we're modernizing but we're still a revolution. And I think it's successful because it weathers the entire social political aspect of what's happening around the world. And it doesn't, the PRI doesn't come to an end until the 2000 election.
Yeah, that's true.
I would argue that by the 1980s, the course has really run the system has run its course, but it's still going to be in power for another 20 years. But I think
Yeah,
Mexico is successful in not converting itself to many other possibilities that could have been much darker, I think.
yeah. As I mentioned, I think the Green Revolution really helped Mexico out a lot, but it really, I would say, as you mentioned, the 1980s with the peso crisis and the economy collapse at that time, that's what really led later on to NAFTA and privatization later down the road, but that was being backed up by the PRI during that time. So you can see that there's this long legacy of what the revolution has had on Mexico for that. But would you like to add anything else on this topic about Mexican Revolution? Anything that we've left out?
Yeah, I actually you were talking. You said NAFTA, and it's like, oh my God, you're right. And that's NAFTA is a wonderful. It's a wonderful example of the contradiction that is the Mexican government or the revolutionary government of the 1990s, where on the one hand it's signing this neoliberal deal, but on the other hand, it says Mexico is a multi-ethnic nation. So it says we're not a mestizo nation. We are truly composed of all these different nations, which are indigenous, and so we have to stop trying to fight to be mestizo. Like we have to actually recognize that we are much more than just mestizo.
Yeah, and that's another thing too. I think people tend to forget is that, like the United States, Mexico is a major melting pot, and there's really cultures from all around the world during that time. Well, to this day, right now, but it during the 20th century, during the 1900s, we see that there was actually a large amount of different people from around the world that did come to Mexico, and they have integrated into society. And it's really is a huge melting pot. And I think people tend to forget about that. They tend to kind of think that, there's the extreme of, oh, you're Spanish, or that we're like this byproduct of Spanish or mestizo. But really, there's cultures from around the world that are in Mexico that are having their impact to this day. And we, of course, see it. Probably one of the most popular snacks of all time is the japoneses cacahuates, right? The Japanese
Oh
immigrant that
my,
comes to
yeah.
Mexico, and they're not even heard of in Japan. But I apologize, I forget the name of the Japanese immigrant. He comes here and he creates the cacahuate japonés, and it becomes so popular. And it's like I always have those in my house, so always have those for road trips. But that just shows you how much of a influence, or perhaps it was perhaps the revolution allowed, we may say that it kicked out foreign investment, but it part also brought in foreigners to also take on a Mexican dream, if you will.
Yeah, fair enough.
Right, maybe. But yeah, if there's anything else you'd like to add to this, or anything, I think that kind of wraps up my most of our questions here.
No, I mean, I just thank you for the invitation
Well, thank
of
you for
being able
joining me.
to talk, and it's fun to bounce off ideas and what we're thinking, and kind of coming to a mutual understanding of what the revolution was or is.
Yeah, it's to this day, I think that history has a lot to offer us, and sometimes we bypass a lot of things in it. And it's kind of like a treasure. We only take out what we need at a time, and then we go back to because we crave more of it. But I think that this history is going to help us really solve a lot of things, how we see the future, how we're going to see how we get ourselves here. And I think that this is why it's important for us to always go back and try to research or try to understand how things came to be in this sense. But Marco, Dr. Macias, thank you very much for joining us here. I hope to see you again at some of our other topics. Maybe we'll finally talk about Cardenas, or even more about Pancho Villa, Zapata, anybody like that. But I thank you once again for joining me here, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. And Viva Pancho Villa, right? His birthday.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and yes, viva Francisco Villa.
Alrighty. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed it, and look forward for future content from Pochtecaland.